This section's on cell referencing. If you don't have the data file available, you'll want to pause at each worksheet and copy the data as it appears on the sheet before proceeding to the lesson. The power of Excel is the ability to reference values in other cells, in other worksheets, in other workbooks. What we don't want to do in Excel is just type in a fixed value. For example, I would want to type the value represented in cell A3 here in cell D3. Rather, it would be better for me to reference the value in cell A3 if I want to use that value in cell D3. I do that by pressing the equal sign and then pointing with my mouse to cell A3 or using the arrow key to arrow over to cell A3. However you want to get there, I could type A3 in there and that would reference the cell once I have an equal sign. That gives me the value in cell D3 that is represented in cell A3. That way, if the value in A3 changes, the value in D3 changes. By pressing F2, I can take a look at the formula that I've typed in the cell and edit that formula if I want to. You might think that I've told Excel to reference the value in cell A3. This is a relative cell reference. What I've really told Excel to do is relative to my current position, which is D3, go 1, 2, 3 cells to the left and get that value. To illustrate that, I'll copy this reference down. As I copy that reference, you'll notice that I've told each subsequent cell the same thing. Relative to your current position, move 1, 2, 3 cells to your left and get the value. That's a relative cell reference. As the position of this reference changes, the cells referenced change as well. As this reference moves down, it looks at the corresponding cell as they move down the column. If I wanted to reference the value in cell A3, absolutely, I would type equals $A $3. That is an absolute cell reference. That's going to get the value in cell A3 no matter where this reference appears. If I copy this down, I'm going to always reference the value in cell A3. It doesn't matter where I copy it. It is absolutely always going to reference the value in cell A3. Now I typed $signs in to get an absolute reference, but you don't have to. We're going to take a look in this section on relative, absolute, and mixed cell references. Mixed cell references are where you either make the column absolute and the row relative, or the column relative and the row absolute. Now I can reference a cell, and by pressing the F4 key, I can change the absolute and relative characteristics of this reference each time I press the F4 key. So the first time I get an absolute cell reference. The second time I get a relative column, absolute row cell reference. The third time I press F4, I get an absolute column, relative row reference. And the fourth time I'm back to a relative cell reference. And it's just a circular toggle. As I press the F4 key, I go around and around with these cell references. All right, let's start some of our exercises. Let's move to the relative tab. Relative tab, we see a little typical business problem. We have items that we sell, item A, B, C, and D. We sell them at a sales price per item, $25 for item A, $10 for item B, and so on. We have a salesperson. His name is Bob. He's out there selling our products. This is his sales history for the past month, 12 of item A, 97 of item B, and so on. We want to calculate his gross sales. Now, this is a great relative reference problem because the input values, the price and the quantity sold, their layout, row and column layout characteristics match the characteristics of our output, which will be sales. You'll notice that this is one column, 4 rows. This is one column, 4 rows. And our sales output will be one column and 4 rows. So let's do the calculation. Here it is up here. Sales equals the price each times, I'll use the asterisk for times in Excel, the quantity sold. Press enter. I get the total, the gross sales for Bob. I can just copy down the autofill node and I get those gross sales values for each item. I can press F2 to check my work and I can see that the sales is based on the calculation of price and quantity for the correct item. All right, let's go to an absolute cell reference. I've introduced a factor here, commission rate. I want to calculate Bob's sales, which we just did. I'll repeat that calculation. Then I want to calculate his commission rate on sales. Now, sales is a great relative referencing problem because the output characteristics match those of the inputs that we have. And in this example, I'm going to use the commission rate to illustrate the absolute cell reference. So I'll calculate sales by taking the price for each item and multiplying it times the quantity sold by Bob of each item. And just another tip, since I have these values to the left of my equation, I don't have to drag the autofill node. If I double click on the autofill node, Excel will look to see if the characteristics of the subsequent rows are similar, the same as those of this row, and it will copy my equation down until the characteristics of the rows are no longer similar. So I'll double click here on the autofill node and it will just fill those for me. It's a little quicker, especially with longer columns of numbers. Now I'll calculate the commission on those sales. And in this case, I'll take sales and multiply it times the commission rate. And I'll press F4 one time and make that value absolute. Press enter. That gives me my commission on those sales. That looks right. I'll double click and autofill that and place my cursor somewhere in one of the calculated fields. Press F2 just to check my work. And I can see that, yeah, I'm getting the correct level of sales for item C and multiplying it times Bob's commission. So that is correct. Now we'll look at an example of an absolute column problem. So what we have here, we have more than one salesperson. We have Bob, Ellen, Kathy, and Bill. They're all out selling the same products and they're all out selling them for the same price each. So we're going to calculate the sales, the gross sales for each of our salespeople. Now, the layout characteristics of the quantity sold are the same as the layout characteristics of our output or sales. But price shares only the row layout characteristics with quantity sold and sales. Price has 4 rows, as does quantity sold and sales. Price only has 1 column, but quantity sold and sales will both have 4 columns. So I'm going to have to use an absolute columnar reference when I refer to price. So I'll take the calculation here is sales equals price each times the quantity sold. So I'll take the level of sales, that's relative, and I'll multiply that times price each, and I'll press F4 1, 2, 3 times to lock the column. That way, as I copy this down, the reference is free to move down and get the correct item price for each item. But as I copy it across, it's locked so that even as I copy it across, it continues to look back to this column, because if it moved across, if it was relative, it would get these blanks, and then ultimately it would get Bob's sales, which quantity sold, which would give me a bad output. Press enter, copy this down, and then copy that over. Place my cursor on one of the calculated columns, press F2, and I can see that sure enough, I have the quantity sold for Kathy of item C and the price of item C. All right, let's do the next one. Well, this is an absolute row example. We'll also do an absolute column as we did in the previous one, but in this example, not only do we have the characteristics of price each as compared to our characteristics of quantity sold and our output characteristics, but we also have the characteristics of commission rate. Each of our salespeople has a different commission rate. Commission rate shares the columnar characteristics with our output, but not the row characteristics. There are 4 columns, but only 1 row. So I'm going to calculate commissions. See the calculation up here. Commissions equals price each times quantity sold times the commission rate. So I'll take the price each, and I'll need to lock the column by pressing F4 1, 2, 3 times, and I'll multiply that times the quantity sold, which I'll leave relative because as I copy this, I want it to look to the correct cell. And then I'll multiply that times the commission rate. And for the commission rate, I have to press F4 2 times to lock the row. As I copy this across, I want it to be free to move across the columns and get the correct commission rate. But as I copy it down, I don't want it to move off of this row, otherwise I'll get bad data. Press enter. Now I'll copy this down, and I'll copy it across. Place my cursor on a calculated cell, press F2, check my work. Sure enough, I am looking at Kathy's commissions, and this equation uses Kathy's level of sales for item C, the correct price, and Kathy's commission rate. So that's correct. Now, let's use all of them. Here we have an example of characteristics where the rows are similar with our output. We have an example where the columns are similar with our output. Now we have an example here where the discount rate. We're going to discount these prices and calculate the effect of that discount on sales commission. This value only appears in one place on our worksheet, so that's going to require an absolute reference. Here's our formula. We're going to take 1 minus our discount and multiply that times the price, quantity sold, and commission rate. 1 minus the discount when multiplied times the price each will give us the new discounted price. So equals 1 minus the discount, which I press F4 1 time to make that absolute. Place that quantity in parentheses. The order of operations, Excel would do all the multiplication first, then the subtraction, but by placing them in parentheses, it'll do the subtraction first and then multiply that quantity times the rest of the values. So now I want to multiply that times the price each, which I need to lock the column. So I'm going to press F4 1, 2, 3 times, multiply that times the quantity sold, which I'll just leave relative, and multiply that times the commission rate, which I need to lock the row. So I'll press 1, 2 to lock the row. I press enter. I get the commission rate for Bob if we apply the discount, copy that down, copy that over, place my cursor on one of the calculated cells, press F2, and I can see that I'm using all of the good data for Kathy in this example. I've got the price each for item C multiplied times the quantity of item C that Kathy sold, and that's the discounted price, because you can see I'm looking up and getting that 10% discount and then applying the commission rate for Kathy. That is a summary of the various types of cell referencing used in Excel. Cell referencing is extremely important to learn, so you want to go over this a few times until you're fairly comfortable with it.